Okay, so you just read about some of the weapons here, and I'm going to walk you through some pictures and explain a couple of pictures to you, and then you have some video links also here in Google Classroom to take a look at when we're done. So I'm going to start with the map. The first thing the book tells us is that lots of soldiers were fighting on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front. This map shows us where that is. So and the Eastern Front is over here between Germany and into Russia, some into Austria-Hungary, and the Western Front is over here. Germany is going to be fighting France here, and most of the trenches are in France. The famous book, All Quiet on the Western Front, takes place here on the Western Front. If you've ever heard of that book, if you haven't heard of it, I do recommend reading it. It's about a German teenager who gets sent to the Western Front. So it's a very good book. All right, let's take a look at the pictures of the trenches. To start with, this is what it looks like when all of these soldiers are in the trenches. The early trenches were in a straight line like this one. Every soldier was given a rifle and a gun, and they were expected to be able to dig a trench for cover. Remember, at this point in time, technology of the weapons are so good that you have to take cover. The open charges out across open ground, everybody's figured out that's gone now. That's a thing of the past because weapons are so effective now, so much more accurate. So to take cover, they dig these trenches to be able to not get shot. And then they do put their guns on the tops of the trenches and shoot at each other, but, guess what? That's hard to hit the enemy. It's hard to hit the enemy, and it's hard to get hit. So it's effective for keeping people alive. It's not going to be so effective when it comes to actually winning a war. Now, we do develop big guns and grenades and things like that, and so what they decide to do for better protection is they make the trenches zigzag. So here, this picture here, we're looking at the trenches from the air, and this is what a trench looks like from the air when it's zigzag. That way, if there's an explosion from a large shell coming in, then it's less likely to kill all these guys here in a straight line. Instead, you've got some earth and dirt and stuff in between to offer some protection. This is what is called going over the top. These are soldiers coming out of the trenches. Very dangerous thing to do because obviously you're going to get shot from your enemy who are still in their trenches a little ways away. So it's very dangerous to come out of to go over the top, and nobody wants to do it. And then you can see there's barbed wire, and then there's also going to be landmines in between the trenches. And so that's going to make it dangerous as well. So no soldier wants to go over the top. But they kind of figure out that, hey, nobody's winning the war. When everybody's sitting in the trenches and shooting at each other, nobody's winning. And to try to win the war, they do start coming out of the trenches, and lots of people die. Let's talk about the guns then. Let's look first at machine guns. At this point in time, machine guns are now effective. They're efficient. They fire hundreds of bullets per minute. They are larger and heavier than what you might imagine, anything like we have today. And you notice it sits on a tripod. It takes a few minutes to get it set up. I don't have any video of them moving a machine gun, but it's very large and heavy. And it takes a few minutes to get it all set up on the tripod. Then notice it takes two people to fire. This guy here, he's firing. This guy is feeding the bullets in. A couple more pictures here. This is one where they are in the trenches shooting a machine gun. That one looks a little bit different. Maybe it could be from a different country. And then these guys here, I like this one because you get a good close-up look at the machine gun. And you can see the bullets flying out over on this side, or the shells. And these guys are wearing gas masks because we're going to talk about our next weapon of World War I, gas. Now, the most common gas used in World War I was called mustard gas, but there were different versions of gas depending on which country was using it and what point in the war we were at. They were always working on the latest technology and developing new stuff. So the first picture I want to show you, though, is the gas from the air, and you can see that the wind will blow the gas, and that means that gas is not a very precise weapon. You can't make sure, it's very difficult to make sure that you get just the enemy troops. If the wind shifts, the gas could blow back on your own troops and kill some of your own troops. Or it could also shift and go into a neighboring town where there's women and children who would get hurt as well. So gas is, this is why we don't use gas in warfare today. It's too easy for innocent people to get killed, or your own troops too. All depending on the wind. Now gas, the most common kind in World War I was mustard gas. And mustard gas burned your throat and burned your eyes. And if you were exposed to it long enough too, it would also burn your skin. So these guys have gas masks on. And the gas masks are only somewhat effective. Again, gas is new technology. Gas masks are new technology. And so mostly, especially at the beginning of the war, gas masks were designed just to give you enough time to get out of the gas. It's not a foolproof thing. If you were exposed to the gas long enough, it would get through the mask. Depending on the country and the point of the war, there was different types of gas masks. The one up here appears to be an early version of the gas mask. And this one over here on the right is very similar to what I've seen American troops wearing. So I'm pretty sure this is an American gas mask. This one, tougher to say. I know the British gas masks looked a little different than ours, but they do improve as the war goes on, but they still generally, they needed to have, they gave you time to get out of the gas. They were not foolproof. Now, gas burned your eyes as well as your lungs. This one here, this picture, you can see the poor guy here on the left. He's definitely in pain. He's having trouble breathing. It's going to burn his throat and his lungs. And if he's exposed to the gas long enough, he's going to die. Unless they can get to him and get a gas mask on him. Like these guys have their masks on. So I'm not sure what happened to this guy. How fast it acts, it depends on what point in the war, and then like I mentioned, there's different types of gas as well. It does burn your eyes as well, and whether or not you recover from the burning of your eyes depends on how long you were exposed to it. And so these guys here, they have their eyes bandaged and they're blind for a while, and then it's just kind of a waiting game to see if their eyes recover or don't recover, or will they be blind for the rest of their lives. Again, it depends on how long they were exposed to the gas, but it's kind of a guessing game as to whether or not they'll get their sight back. Now, I'm going to show you this next picture, and it is a little bit gruesome, so don't feel like you have to look at it. But this is what happens when you're exposed to the gas to your skin. And again, different types of gas, and I couldn't find exactly what type of gas did this. But you can see his skin is blistered and very sore. I read, though, that he's a Belgium soldier and that he does recover, if that helps you feel any better. But again, different types of gas and how long you're exposed to it could cause injuries such as this one. All right, let's talk about tanks. We realize that nobody's winning the war when we're all sitting in the trenches, and they need to get to the other side. We need to get to the enemy to be able to kill them. So they design tanks. So the first tanks come out here in World War I. They might look a little different than what you were expecting. This is the very first tanks. Notice there's not a humongous gun on the top, but there are guns on the sides. And here I'll show you in the next picture. You can see the guns on the sides a little better, and you can see the guys up here trying to drive. They get rushed into production. They're seen as going to be like, oh, this is it. This is going to help us win the war. So they rush them into production. They're not perfect, though. They go pretty slow. They do get stuck. They do have engine problems. So, yeah, they do help in the war, but the British and the French are the main ones that are making them. So, yeah. Oh, one more. This one is stuck. Because, yeah, they did get stuck. Let's talk about airplanes. Airplanes in World War I look like this. We call these bi-wings, where they have two wings. Notice that the cockpit is open, and so the pilot is going to be wearing, it's going to be cold. He's out in the air. He's going to be wearing goggles and a hat and stuff. Some of them do have room for two people. It kind of depends on the plane, depends on the country, what type of planes they have. So, but the pilot is out in the open. This is new technology in World War I, so we're still figuring out what to do with it. No country has an air force just yet, but they do have guns on them, usually machine guns. Usually it's the pilot shooting the gun, and we're kind of, so as far as being accurate, we're still kind of figuring that out. They do shoot at each other in the air and shoot each other down. But like I said, no country has an organized air force at this point. So, yeah. Now, there is a famous pilot known as the Red Baron, and the Red Baron was a German pilot who was very good at shooting down other airplanes until eventually he gets shot down. They do try to drop bombs out of the airplanes, but truly it's the pilot holding it in his hand and dropping it over the side. We haven't quite worked out all the math involved in targeting either, so it is not a very precise weapon. U-boats. Okay, so here's Germany, and Germany needs to be able to trade to get supplies, and to be able to trade, they need to be able to get to the sea and get to the ocean. And so Great Britain doesn't want them to be able to trade, because obviously they're fighting them, and they don't want them to get supplies. So they mine the North Sea and try to block in Germany so they don't get to the ocean. So and it turns out to be very effective. Now, when I say they mine the North Sea, this is what a mine looks like in World War I. And from everything I've read, it is pretty good at exploding when splashed or bumped and things. So it is a very effective way to keep the German boats in. So the Germans, though, not to be deterred, they were like, hey, we still need supplies. So they developed what they called under the sea boats, or shortened up to U-boats. Today we call them submarines, to get underneath the mines, because the mines did float on the water. Now, in a harbor, they could be anchored to a spot in a harbor where it's a little more shallow, but out on the open sea, they just let them float on the ocean. And so the German subs were able to go underneath them. Now, German subs are not nice places to be. They are small and crowded, and they're dangerous, because guess what? If the sub gets hit, it's going down, and there's no life jackets, there's no saving the crew. The crew is going to be at the bottom of the ocean, and they're all going to be dead. So they're dangerous places to be. Here's this one, shows you a little bit how crowded they are. They're all about guns and engines, and they're not too worried about keeping the crew comfortable. So yeah, they have minimal space here for the crew. They are also kind of stinky, too. Between everything I've read, they talk about the smell of the engines, just not a lot of good air circulation, and yeah, it's kind of stinky places to be as well. So they didn't put a ton of people on them. They would keep them, an average crew would be about 15 men. Again, dangerous. So the biggest thing with the submarine is that they can sneak up on an enemy. If you can see a submarine, then you can shoot at it, and they're not very fast at this point in time, not in World War I. So staying out of sight was key to them staying alive. And so they could come up on a ship and fire a torpedo and turn around and leave and never be seen. They could kind of see the general direction the torpedo came from, but the ship would not be able to see the submarine to even know the depth of it. So that staying out of sight was key. Well, this is a game changer in the rules of war, because generally in the past they would when they fought on the ocean, you could always see the enemy coming. You could have time to get the innocent people into lifeboats. You could have time to prepare. That the submarine changes all of that. The other part that it changes is the fact that they don't pick up any survivors. Notice there's no room for prisoners of war. So if you were on a ship that sunk, you went into the water, you were on your own. There was no picking up prisoners of war from the other side. And also remember, at this time, people didn't take the time to learn how to swim. Swimming was kind of a luxury thing, and so generally most people at this time did not take swimming lessons, did not learn how to swim. So if you went into the water, you were going to drown. And the U-boat, they would just turn around and leave you there. So it was kind of seen as being kind of mean on the part of the Germans. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to stop this video and do a second one.